I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Daniel Monti. Dr. Monti is the founding director and chief executive officer of the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Jefferson Health and founding chair of the Department of Integrative Medicine and Nutritional Sciences at Sidney Kimmel Medical College at Thomas Jefferson University. Dr. Monti is an expert in integrative medicine, which is a scientific approach to health and healing that enhances conventional medicine with a broader range of treatment options than most doctors offer. This can improve patients' experiences and, most importantly, outcomes. In addition to working with patients, Dr. Monti is the author of several books for patients looking to utilize integrative medicine to live healthier lives, and his scholarly research is widely published. The books are Tapestry of Health, Weaving Wellness into Your Life Through the New Science of Integrative Medicine, The Brain Weaver, Creating the Fabric for a Healthy Mind Through Integrative Medicine. Dr. Monti received his medical degree summa cum laude from State University of New York School of Medicine at Buffalo. Beyond traditional residency, he completed a research program in neuroscience and later earned a Master of Business Administration with honors from Temple University Fox School of Business. He holds board certification from the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and the American Board of Holistic and Integrative Medicine. Today's topic is what the Blue Zones teaches us about longevity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Monti.
Thank you for that very nice introduction, Linda. Appreciate it. Happy anniversary, Dr. Pratap, Barbara Levitt, and all of the Yoga Research Society. 50 years, wow. Now, you have me at the end of the day, so my job is to prevent you from, early melatonin releases. But since I'm following Dr. Brainerd, who's such a great speaker, hopefully you're ready for a little more information. I would like to start by saying that all of Dr. Pratap's work is so fitting for this topic of blue zones, because basically if you live the way that he tells you to live, you're in a blue zone. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. I met Dr. Pratap for the first time. I don't know if he remembers this. He might remember this. I met Dr. Pratap for the first time when I first came to Philadelphia, still in my training, a medical intern in the 1990s. And there's this bookstore on South Street you're probably all familiar with, the Garland of Letters. It's still there. It stood the test of time. And in the basement of the Garland of Letters, Dr. Pratap gave yoga classes. I think for decades you were there. I don't know when that started. I went to one of those classes, and I remember thinking, wow, this is really somebody special. And when I had the opportunity to take charge of integrative medicine at Jefferson, Barbara and Dr. Pratap and all of YRS were people that I wanted to stay connected to. And we've been thrilled to have that connection with them for all of these years and to continue to be as supportive to this conference as possible. It's such an important event, and this year, with the significance of 50 years, is really special. So it's wonderful to be part of this program today, and thank you all for having me. So the blue zones Many of you have probably heard of them because they got all of this media attention. And what's really interesting about them is they are more of an observation than a super scholarly study, but then people have begun to study them. And first I need to tell you, well, this isn't a CME event, it doesn't matter. So we're going to talk about the blue zones. So as we get to the blue zones themselves, there are these geographic areas where people live longer, and they also live better. They have fewer chronic illnesses, such as coronary artery disease, cancer, cognitive decline, type 2 diabetes, all of the things that plague us in a lot of Western countries, particularly this one, particularly the United States, and yet there is one blue zone in the United States, as you can see. Now, a lot of people don't know where the term came from. They've heard about them, but actually an author, Dan Buettner, whose work the Netflix series was based upon, if those of you saw it, used a blue pen to mark 5 distinct areas with long-lived populations on that. These are the original 5 blue zones, and you can see they're sort of spread across the map. Okinawa, Japan, Icaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, Costa Rica, and even a little community in Loma Linda, California. And so what is it about these blue zones? It isn't that it's just one little pocket of the world, but there's these pockets throughout the world. And when people started to look more closely at, are there some common characteristics to the blue zones, there are some things that emerge. And these are things that aren't so surprising maybe to a group like you that's thinking about your health and your wellness, but it's a reminder to the rest of us that these things really do matter. They matter for our longevity, and not just how long we live, but how well we live. And so one of those is largely plant-based diets. So that means getting plants into your body, living food into your body. This is something that has gotten to be a real issue in countries like the United States because there aren't a lot of plants in a lot of people's diets. And moderate intake of calories. In the United States, we have an excess of calories. So what we have is a lot of calorie-rich food, but it's nutrient poor. And we'll talk more about that, but it's one of the contributing factors to most of the United States being very different than a blue zone in terms of how long we live and how well we live. The blue zones tend to focus a little bit on having ways of diminishing stress. Stress is a real killer. We're a mind body. Our mind isn't separate from our bodies, and I have a few slides to talk about how we got into that conundrum of thinking in that very disparate way. But for those of you practicing yoga, mind and body are one. And having a way to navigate our stress, exercise being a good way, physical activity, that next one, yoga being a tremendous form of exercise, really makes a difference. Involvement in community, family, basically that social component of life. Having community events that people frequently go to. So glad that this one was live. I actually, for those who are connected to our department and the Marcus Institute, know that Thursday and Friday, we had a conference on integrative nutrition, and for many reasons, we had to switch it to being completely virtual. It was actually supposed to be across the hall from here. And it's not the same experience as being together in community. And there are biological effects when we're connected to other people. There are positive biological effects to being connected with people, and the disconnect that occurred over the pandemic had deleterious effects on lots of groups of people, and this is well known and well documented, and I'll talk about some of the data. But basically, that connectivity with others is something that's so critical and so important. And perfect for following Dr. Brainerd's talk. They sleep at night, particularly people who live to 100 or more. Those, when they did little subgroup analyses, people are sleeping. We, almost wear it as a badge of honor that, I only got a few hours of sleep because I was working late or reading over this or doing that. And really, we need that sleep. And so sleep hygiene, which is a lot of what that previous talk was about, like how do we ensure that we have good quality sleep? I won't talk about it too much more since you just had a lecture from one of the biggest experts in the world on it, but it's so critical, it's so important. So what's going on in our country then, in the United States? Largely, we're the opposite of a blue zone. Instead of people living longer like they do in the blue zones and people living better like they do in the blue zones, chronic disease is on the rise. And those numbers just keep getting more and more like that. If we look at subgroups of chronic disease, if we look at things like diabetes, it just keeps going up, trending up. And one of the other things that keeps trending up along with diabetes is obesity. They go hand in hand. And obesity, diabetes, these types of things, even cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, have direct correlates to lifestyle. They have direct correlates to some of the things that we mentioned in the blue zones, but that we'll talk about in a little more depth. And life expectancy in the United States is disappointing, given that we have plenty of medicine. It isn't that there's, a dearth of medical science. We have medicine everywhere, right? But life expectancy isn't that good. And here's the most important one for me, healthy life expectancy, which means living long without morbidities, without diseases, without those chronic ailments that we just talked about. We never make the top 10 list. We never make the top 10 list for healthy life expectancy. So we don't live as long and we don't live as well. In a way, we're the opposite of a blue zone. And it isn't because we're not spending money on healthcare. Oh, we spend money on healthcare. And we spend more than anybody else. And we spend more out of pocket than anybody else. And yet, this is the status of things. So one of the big disconnects is medicine, healthcare, and health. Because there's lots of medicine. There's even lots of healthcare. But there's something else that's missing from the equation, because medicine does not equal health. We go back to the lessons of the blue zones that I'm going to keep talking about, but health is about a lot more than medicine, because we know that our lifestyle, including diet, nutrition, nutrients, lack of nutrients, sufficient macronutrients, balanced macronutrients, stress, how we navigate it, exposure to toxins, that this is actually what accounts for that healthy life expectancy that you saw in the previous slides. Because, we used to think about things, I'll beat it to it, we used to think about things in terms of the genes being the controller of everything. I guess I didn't. So that basically, listen, if my father had type 2 diabetes, then I'm going to have type 2 diabetes because it's just in the genes. So that idea between genes and environment wasn't that well understood, but it has been now for decades. And yet, there's still this sort of a disconnect, because it isn't just the genes who are important. Genes are important, and they play a role. But as we hit adulthood and then the middle decades of life, healthy life expectancy, longevity, have so much more to do with how we play the genes. What does that mean? So genes just, don't sit there inert. Genes are this constantly active thing that are responding to the milieu that they're in. And that milieu that they're in is what we'll call the environment, and that's what sort of the field of epigenetics is all about, is everything the genes are exposed to, from your diet to how you're perceiving the world in terms of stress, emotional state, those kinds of things, whether or not you're active, activity level, exercise, those kinds of things, toxins, some of that we can't control, but look how much we can. Because if we use the analogy of the metaphor of keys on the keyboard, the analogy of a pianist, and we think about, for example, the keys on the keyboard being the genes. So the keyboard itself is somewhat important, right? So if we imagine two pianos in the room, we'll put my grandmother's old upright piano from childhood there with, a little bit of the ivory flicked off of some of the keys, relatively in tune, but, maybe not perfect. We put a beautiful Steinway grand piano here. Now, it is true if you're, a musician, you're gonna notice some of the changes in those keyboards, right? Remember, the keyboards are the genes. So, some people are born with a Steinway grand piano set of genes. Some people have more my grandmother's upright piano. But remember, it's the player. It's what those genes are exposed to, how we play the genes, what we do with those genes. So if we put me at the Steinway grand piano with my couple of years of failed piano lessons with Mrs. Lichtenstein breathing on my neck with her bad breath, and me never wanting to practice kind of thing, and I don't think I remember much now. And we bring Mozart back from the dead and put him, I used to say Horowitz, but who was my favorite pianist, but then people were like, who's Horowitz? So we bring Mozart back from the dead and we put him at my grandmother's old upright piano. Whose music are you going to listen to? Where's that beautiful music going to come from? Because even if there's not quite the sound quality there, boy, can that be some pretty beautiful music coming out of Mozart versus, on the Steinway grand piano. And see, think about this too. I mean, there's people who've overcome a lot with the genes they have and really thrive. There's people who had the genes, think about like these star athletes. Now, some continue to still be in really great shape later in life, but think about the ones, we've all seen them, who sort of let it all go. They stop playing the keyboard very well, right? And then you see them like 20 years after they were this peak performance, and they have cardiovascular disease, and they're out of shape, and they have this problem and that problem because they've completely stopped playing the genes that they have. So the genes we're born with have some importance, but how we play them, what we expose those genes to, is everything. And that's why the blue zones, you've got them in different genetic populations throughout the world. It isn't just the genes that people were born with. It's how in those little pockets of the world they play the genes, how they expose the genes in the environment, and how those genes express themselves. Because the genes, plus how they express themselves based upon environmental factors, are what we call the phenotype. And so that's you in your current version. Not just how you look, but a little bit how you look, how you function, how you feel, whether or not you can perform well at work or in your daily tasks, how your brain is doing, how you're feeling emotionally. That phenotype has a whole lot more to do for most of us. I mean, there's exceptions and there's genetic issues and things like that with the environment side of this. And so how we play the genes, it determines our phenotype. And so in integrative medicine, we do a lot of what we call deep phenotyping, where we're trying to really understand what the phenotype is doing, from general labs to genomics profiling and things like that, so we really get an understanding of that. But the other way we understand that too is we try to understand what you're doing in your life, because we know what was observed in the blue zones has a direct correlation to how people perform in life. And then I'm going to review some of the studies that make that very clear. So nutrition is something that we spend a lot of time on in my department. And if we sort of just start with what do we know about the nutritional environmental factors, some of this I mentioned in the introductory slide, but the nutrients themselves. So do we have enough of the micronutrients, the vitamins and essential minerals and the phytonutrients that aren't even that well characterized? And what is the balance of macronutrients? Macronutrients, remember, fat, carbohydrates, protein. And it isn't that macronutrients are bad or good, because oftentimes people talk about groups of macronutrients as bad. Fat is bad. Carbohydrates are bad. It isn't that they're bad. It's what kind of each of them are you getting and in what proportion. So we know, like, for carbohydrates, there's very simple carbohydrates, which are more like a sugar or a starch, that in excess can have quite deleterious effects on health. Whereas we know that another carbohydrate, like a vegetable in its natural state, or a whole grain in its unadulterated state, can have very positive effects on health. So it isn't that the category of macronutrients, carbohydrates, is bad. It's that in excess of the adulterated ones. And this word adulterated, we're going to hear this a lot because another word for it is refined, highly refined. So it's basically we've taken something that maybe occurred in nature and then we've done something with it where it's very far from that thing that was naturally occurring in nature. The blue zones eat, excuse me, a lot of nutrient-dense food. And so what does that mean? They eat food that's close to its natural state, so not much refined carbohydrates, not many fats that actually shouldn't even be in your food. They eat things that are in their natural state, and not too much of it. That's the other thing. In fact, the rule in one of the blue zones, the Okinawa Islands, is to, excuse me, is to eat till you're 80% full. I couldn't imagine convincing most of my patients to do that. The plant-based foods are key to this because you get the right balance of things in carbohydrates when you eat plant-based foods. Now, fats are something that are really interesting, and I'll show you a slide on fats later on, but we have fats that actually increase inflammation in the body, which is the mechanism that spurs almost every disease process, and we'll talk about that. And there's fats that actually decrease inflammation in the body. And you've heard of the good ones, like omega-3s and omega-9s. We want lots of those fats. We don't want a fat-free diet, but we want to minimize the fats that are a problem in the diet. And so thinking in this all-or-nothing way with any macronutrient is a problem because it doesn't actually appreciate that there's really important critical things of each of those macronutrients that we want in our diet. And when people say, I'm going to be on a no-carb diet, I don't think they even really mean that when they say it. I think what they mean, I hope what they mean, is that they're going to be on a diet that's low in the carbs that are problematic, like simple sugars and starches, and focus more on carbohydrates like plants. Plants, that's a carbohydrate you want in a plant. We'll mention this a couple of times, but the gut microbiome is critical. But if we're paying attention to diet and we're eating those plants that have the fibers that feed the microbiota, which then do what they're supposed to do to help to balance health, we often don't have to worry about it. The problem in my practice is we see people who that's been kind of destroyed, and so you have to find ways of recultivating the gut microbiome when people really have pushed the system too far along. Now, there's individual data points that I'll kind of go over from studies that drive home these concepts about diet. So for example, we know that plant-based dietary patterns decrease the risk of type 2 diabetes when people are eating healthfully and they're bringing plant-based foods into the diet. And that's the way I kind of think about it too, and you should think about it for yourself. So, you know, if the issue is you need more plant-based foods, think about it as bringing more of them in versus not eating or depriving in another category. Just the more plants you eat, this is what I find from working with people over the last 20 years, the more plants you eat in a plant-based diet, and I know that, Dr. Pratap is a proponent of a plant-based diet. The more plants you eat, the less you have to worry about what not to eat. And so my focus always is eat more plants versus don't do this, don't do that. If people feel like they're being scolded or they're being deprived, you start off in the wrong direction. But we'll talk more about like how we get to the blue zones. The data is clear, though, that this is the direction to go. And so in terms of like processed products, so processed products, again, are taking something that grows, and then we do something to it to make it far from that. So corn grows, and corn is okay if it's fresh. Corn on the cob, it really, it is a crop that was at one time more for farm animals, but it's a bit starchy, but if you get it fresh off the farm and have a piece of corn on the cob, that's fine. High fructose corn syrup is, now we've gone to a highly processed product, right? Because after they press the corn and they have the corn syrup, then to make it high fructose corn syrup, they heat it at these super high temperatures. And then there's all these byproducts that are in it that are problematic too, and this is being studied. And the glycemic index of high fructose corn syrup is through the chart, so that your blood sugar just when you ingest the high fructose corn syrup, and that constant up and down of the blood sugar is what then leads to insulin resistance and then ultimately type 2 diabetes. And so that's why in our country we have far higher rates of type 2 diabetes, and we have far higher ingestion of high fructose corn syrup. Now, listen, there's reasons for this. Basically, the politics of food is interesting, just like the politics of everything else. And the country has been subsidizing the corn growers since the 1970s. That's why right around in the 1970s, sugar used to be like in sodas, and I'm not saying sugar is a health food, right? But it actually is a little bit better in terms of the impact on blood sugar. It's the glycemic index. And so it was sugar, just like you see when you travel sometimes in other countries. It's, the sodas have sugar in them instead of high fructose corn syrup. But in our country, we subsidized farmers to make the high fructose corn syrup because we weren't really utilizing enough of their corn for other things, and so that's what we have. I mean, we could make the decision as a nation to subsidize farmers to do other things, to grow more organic foods or things like that, but this is the decisions that have been made. But it does account for why there is so much of a problem with high fructose corn syrup and why all of the sodas that people are drinking is contributing so much to the problems that we see. Then I include this study because, we're talking about plant-based, and I don't tell everybody that they must be vegan. I think it's actually a vegan diet can be very healthy for some people, and for some groups of chronic illnesses, I may encourage it. But one thing is clear, that an excess of red meat is problematic, particularly processed red meats. I mean, across the board, those have been shown to be linked to cancer risk. But what I found interesting about this study that just came out last year, it was a very well done study and a very good journal, is that people used to think about eating lots of meat as protective of type 2 diabetes because, well, protein. But the issue is there's a lot more in the red meat than the protein. And you've got these possible mechanisms that I mentioned there. But again, those are more theoretical. What's not theoretical are the results of the study. The results of the study are clear. And so we know that this is a problem. We also know when we look at population-based studies that certain types of diets have an impact on certain health outcomes. So if we turn to cardiovascular disease, this study from the New England Journal of Medicine, which got a lot of attention, this is more than a decade ago, it got so much attention. Has it impacted our eating behaviors in the United States as much as everybody hoped it would? Not really, but some impact, and also it provides some support. And there's been a lot of studies after this one, but I always like to sort of give this one the credit that it deserves because the big aha was not just the components of the Mediterranean diet, which many of you are probably familiar with, basically a plant-based diet where you eat plenty of vegetables, legumes, some animal protein is allowed, but small quantities in the blue zones. Very small quantities of animal protein. Tendency is to eat fish on the Mediterranean diet whenever possible, but a focus on healthy fats, taking in healthy fats. Now, in this study, which I really loved, they divided people, put my phone there to make sure I just don't talk too long. They divided people into the experimental group. And in the experimental group, they subdivided the experimental group into people who are on the Mediterranean diet, and they also made sure they got enough healthy fat by giving them either olive oil or mixed nuts. And then the other group was basically a dietary counseling group where the dietary counseling was focused on low fat, a low fat diet, because that was the thinking of the time, avoid fat, no fat. Remember these no fat fads? Avoid fat at all, don't eat fat. It was a fatophobic thing. But what was flawed in the thinking is how critical and important healthy fat is. And what this study showed was that even if people weren't perfect, because you're not going to be perfect, your patients aren't going to be perfect. If you're a healthcare provider, your friends aren't going to be, not going to be perfect, but we have to just try to be good enough most of the time. And if you're good enough most of the time, the body has a lot of reserve. The problem is that many people aren't good enough of the time, and so this leads to a lot of downstream problems. So what they found is people who were just on the diet, pretty good, and made sure that they got in this extra olive oil and mixed nuts, did way better in terms of cardiovascular health outcomes and all-cause mortality, so much so that they had to stop the study early. They're like, all right, we can't even keep telling people in the other group to be doing that. We have to be telling people to eat like this. And again, this is something that people have known now for a little while, but there's a disconnect. We also know if we switch over to cancer, that independent of body weight, and I say that because we know that body weight can contribute to cancer. So excess body weight is responsible for, they estimate 20 to 30% of different types of cancers, such as breast cancer. And so consumption of plants reduces cancer and cardiovascular disease mortality. Now, what was great about this is it underscored sort of what I said before, which is the more the better. So no matter how many plant-based foods you're eating right now, take inventory, aim for some more. The more the better. And that's the approach I take with people because the more plants you eat, the better it's going to be for you, the better the health outcomes. I mean, and for people who ate, at least 7 portions of plant-based foods in a day, I mean, they were off the charts in terms of risk. Their risk was so much lower. Now, here's where this did not hold. Canned. Especially canned fruits, but vegetables too. I mean, we've all seen canned fruits, right? Is that like fruit? I mean, that's pretty far from the fruit. And what happens there is that the lining of the can, in addition to all of the chemicals they put in there to preserve the fruit, has bisphenols in them, which leach into those products, and we know that those are toxic and deleterious for health. And so this is just one of those great studies that showed we don't get the same effects if it's canned. Now, different if, you do what, my grandmother used to do and jar your own stuff. If you get a bushel of something at the end of the season, we used to do, tomatoes and things like that. That's different than this. We called that canning, but that's not this can. So it's not the can that you buy in the supermarket. And so we want to minimize those because even though it seems as if we're eating something healthy, not so healthy. So this study, which was also a really great, large population-based study of ultra-processed foods and cancer risk, as we sort of focus on cancer risk, found that, consumption of minimally or unprocessed foods, so foods in their natural state, was associated with lower risks of overall cancer and particularly breast cancer. And so what they found is these ultra-processed, that the ultra-processed foods came from these different sources that you can see here. And again, if we look at just breast cancer, this has been, again, repeated, that same kind of concept. Vegetables, fruits, whole grains reduce the risk of death from breast cancer. So in this study, these were women who had already been diagnosed with cancer, and so were put on dietary modification programs. And for those women who they had a 20% lower risk of dying of the disease. We know that the sugary drinks that I was just talking about increase the risk of cancer. This study that came out in 2019 got a lot of media attention. I'm not sure that it translated to a lot of behavioral change, because one of the things that I've learned in my career is that data or knowledge does not translate to behavior change. Behavioral change is difficult. We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. But we know this. Now, I also think that the more we know it and the more we're reminded of it, maybe this can impact at least what we expose people in our lives to, children to, these kinds of things. I find it problematic, really, with all of this data that so many schools have soda machines and things like that. But again, I'll get off on politics a little bit, and no one wants me doing that this week. So, so I think that, we really have to be thinking about those things. Now, what was really important information that came up about this was that it isn't just soda. That people who thought that they were being healthier by drinking lots of fruit juices. But while it's not high fructose corn syrup, it's still a lot of fructose. And there's a certain point at which when you're drinking a lot of fructose, you're still messing up your metabolism. And so an excessive, juice. Think about this. I can remember being a kid and in my aunt's china cabinet were these juice glasses that never get used anymore, right? Does anybody remember these juice glasses, right? How big were they? Little juice glasses, right? Not juice glasses, right? And so that's really about, we should never consume more of a juice of something than we would eat of the actual thing. So when people tell me, should I juice carrots? I'm like, put them in your smoothie. And, if you put them in your smoothie, you'll probably have one, maybe two in your smoothie, something like that. But to juice a pound of carrots, even though carrots are good, right? Carrots have good things in them. But when you take an excessive, and that's not even a fruit juice, right? And fruit juices because not enough people do, carrot juice. But when you talk about the fruit juices, the glycemic index on them is really, really high because fructose has a high glycemic index. Now, I think it's fine. We have a mom's market over there, so sometimes at lunch I'll go and I'll get, kind of an all-green juice because they only juice. They don't make the smoothies, but I tell them to hold the apple out of it. So it's celery, cucumber, things like that, where there is no sugar. Very, very little sugar. So you're not getting that glycemic. That's the problem, the glycemic load. And also when it comes to fructose, we know that cancer cells like it. Now, you're not out of the woods if you say, okay, all of this sugar stuff, I'll just drink diet beverages. Now, in terms of a processed product, we know that these are artificial chemicals with some exceptions. We'll talk about the exceptions. And, in this study, aspartame, NutraSweet, remember when, so diet, that's what almost every diet soda is sweetened with. This does not lead to health outcomes when we have an excess of those things because those are chemicals. Now, what's not included in these studies are some of the more natural, they're still a little processed, but more natural plant-based sweeteners, which I think are better. Now, the problem is I don't have enough data to really promote them, but when I want a little bit of a sweet flavor, I will use, one of them, like maybe some stevia or monk fruit or things like that. Probably don't want to even use those in some great excess because they're still processed. They're not these things, though. These things do not occur in nature. At least those other things do. And this study I found really interesting, too, because it underscores that something metabolically weird is happening with these chemically based artificial sweeteners. Because women who drink them in pregnancy, it affects the BMI of the offspring. Very interesting. In a negative way, of course. And so, as we turn from cancer to say, oh my goodness, to cognitive decline, dementia, things that people really worry about and are on the rise, we know that dietary approaches can make a big difference. And this is why in the blue zones, you see less of this. This is what, now, again, nothing completely takes away the risk of anything, but when we apply these general principles, we see far less risk. And so in the blue zones, and in studies where we try to emulate a blue zone and we eat that way, so the MIND diet was really just an adaptation of the Mediterranean diet that we talked about before. It's a plant-based diet. In this particular one, they really pay attention to limiting intake of animal foods because they're high in saturated fat, and saturated fat is something that people really pay attention to with dementia risk. And the thing that was different, just so in the Etrug study in the New England Journal of Medicine, the thing they really emphasized was the excess fat. In this diet, they told people, make sure you do that, but they really tried to get people to eat berries and leafy green vegetables because for them, they wanted to make sure people were having enough of getting enough of the micronutrients from those types of foods. And so what you saw was just a far greater risk reduction for the people on this MIND diet. And so as we think about the pathway of some of the things that are on these Mediterranean-type diets, I had mentioned several times the fat, and that all fat is not created equally. If we look at just the metabolic pathway for the essential fatty acids, omega-6, which is in seed oils, and omega-3, which you've all heard about, aquatic sources. Also, you can get them from flax seeds. Omega-9s are very good too. Those are the monounsaturated fats and are also anti-inflammatory. But you can see that the omega-6 pathway, which is why there's a lot of attention to minimizing an excessive amount of seed oils. Now, we all need some omega-6 essential fatty acids in the diet. The problem is you never have to think about getting enough. In fact, the only thing you have to think about getting enough of is the other ones so that you balance your 6-to-3 ratio. Because what you want are those two to be in check with enough of the omega-3s. We also know by getting enough of those healthy fats in that corresponds with brain volume and hippocampal volume. And this also then later corresponds in other studies with mood and how we feel and how we function. This study, I thought, was really important when it came out. And that is, we need enough protein. We do. And so oftentimes people are like, oh, I would become more plant-based, but I'm afraid that I won't get enough protein, and that's going to be bad for me. Getting too much animal protein, I've shown in some of the other studies, is bad for you, and it's inflammatory. But this particular study that looked at all-cause mortality and cause-specific mortality, I mean, look at this. I'm going to read the conclusions here with you in this large prospective study. So this is very high quality. This is in the Journal of the American Heart Association. We found that higher plant protein intake and substitution of animal protein with plant protein were associated with lower risk of all-cause mortality, cerebrovascular disease mortality, and dementia mortality. And so we further identified nuts as potential healthier alternatives for things like red meat and other eggs, dairy products, and legumes. And so this was a follow-up of the WHI study of over 110,000 women. So I'm going to switch, in the interest of time, to just making mention again of the gut microbiome, because we know that paying attention to the good bacteria of the gut, which means eating fermented foods when possible, so those fermented foods that that Dr. Pratap and Barbara tell you to eat them, and the vegetables. So that remember, the fiber of the vegetables is what feeds the gut microbiome. Now, not every fiber does that, but every prebiotic food is a fiber. And what happens is the fibrous part of the plant resists digestion in the small bowel, goes to the large intestine, where a fermentation process occurs, and that is the food for the good bacteria, the microbiota, right? And then what happens is those microbiota produce something called short-chain fatty acids. Some of them have become popular, like butyric acid. And those short-chain fatty acids feed then the gastrocytes of the gut. So that's part of what makes the gut healthy, is what the gut microbiota feed the gut cells. And when there's a sufficient amount of them, some of them go into the circulation of the body to have other positive effects. And in fact, those short-chain fatty acids make their way to the brain because they go through the the blood-brain barrier, and hence the gut-brain connection. And one of the big things of the gut-brain connection is the gut microbiome producing the short-chain fatty acids that make themselves into the brain. I've mentioned the politics of food, and I'll mention it one more time, because we thought about fat only as a problem for coronary artery disease, and we now know that actually there was data that was suppressed, and this is a real problem. And this has been corrected, but of course we had to deal with, I don't know why it's doing that, we had to deal with decades of incorrect information where the only focus was fat. We now know that sugar, and now of course, we were subsidizing sugar back then, and it switched to high fructose corn syrup, which is even worse. Right, now that I said that, we can move on. So there's a disconnect that we have outside of the blue zones between mind and body. We don't actually think about them in an integrated enough way. And part of that disconnect comes from outside of the United States, actually. There were European philosophers and scientists that sort of pushed it in this direction. So we all heard of, Cartesian dualism. And, some of the backstory behind that has to do with the church, let him exhume bodies to study things. And so the mind and the soul were the churches, and the body was science, as if they were very distinct, separate things. And then, really, 17th and 18th century science kind of galvanized this concept a little bit more. Because you had Descartes, but then you had Newtonian physics, for example, which, by the way, is correct. What's the problem with it, though? Why is it a problem to sort of think about us in that kind of science? The problem with this is, if you think about it, this is the science of the non-living world. This is the science of the inanimate world. A living system doesn't correspond to that type of physics. Now, that physics helps us even in some of the medical equipment that's made and things like that, but it doesn't actually describe how a living system works. Because a living system is based upon networks. And we're a network within a network within a network within a network. And the networks are nonlinear. They generate feedback loops. They have the capacity for self-regulation and self-organizing. You can't, self-organization, like organ regeneration, we do that. We can mess up our liver and then unless we mess it up too bad, it kind of comes back. Those hepatocytes are pretty amazing like that. Newtonian physics can't explain that. That's a whole other set of science. And so the fact that last box in a living system, parts exist by means of each other, like not in relation to each other. Like we, in a way, I want to make sure that I don't, we in a way we often talk about ourselves when we think about evolution as, we came from this and then we know this and we know this. It really doesn't matter, because if we think about this network, right? If you're a one-celled organism, if you're an amoeba in a petri dish, you don't have a brain, but there's a consciousness. You can sense light, darkness. You can sense food in the petri dish, which might be little parts of like decomposed bacteria. You go around, you surround it, bring it in. Like there's a consciousness in one cell, a one-celled organism. We have consciousness in the cells of our body. There's lots of data of that. We have in our immune system something called B memory cells that have a biochemical kind of memory to them when we're faced with the same antigen over and over again. When we have an injury, there's electromagnetic energy going across the body, mobilizing different repair systems and things like that. So that's science that sort of separated us from thinking about ourselves and being connected to ourselves, did tremendous service for the non-living world, but was it a bit of a disservice in terms of understanding us, living systems. And if we think about this in terms of like mind and body, the blue zones, if you remember, pay attention to stress and stress reduction. And when we're in a state of chronic stress, this is what chronically happens, right? And so these are just some of the things that can go on, because there's downstream things even beyond that, right? Because the same catecholamines or chemicals or neuropeptides that cause, say, the arrhythmia or the hypertension also have receptor sites on white blood cells that are affecting immune responses. And so we know that actually when we're experiencing something, all of our body is experiencing it. And you might subjectively have noticed that in ways, but it's happening in all the ways you don't notice. And so that's why it's so important to be thinking about how do you navigate your own stress response? And are you doing some of those exercises you know you should be doing to help you to do that? Because we are a mind body. And if we don't think about ways of navigating the stress system that you see there, then we're not going to really have the same kind of outcomes that the people in the blue zones do. And we know, as I said, these downstream effects of what you saw there from the different neuropeptides and catecholamines affect everything and affect how well we launch an immune response, and over time, whether or not we have autoimmune responses. Because there's a relationship to autoimmunity and stress and trauma, as well as dietary patterns and things like that. Because again, that dysregulation of the immune system has multifactorial things involved with it. So remember this slide way back almost an hour ago, right? So it left us. So this slide, this reminder that it's how we play our genes. The phenotype we have today is how we play our genes. And if we think about then the psychosocial stress and all of the things that mitigate that, remember from the blue zones, activity, not just physical activity, but community activity, coming together like this, laughing, sleeping enough, all of those things mitigate stress levels so that you can have more of that blue zone vibrancy. Because it goes back and forth, right? So it on one hand, how well you navigate stress and how well you have ways of sort of coping with the stressors of daily life can affect the body. Things that we do can affect our emotional state. So whether or not we're eating certain foods, a certain type of diet, getting in the right balance of macronutrients or micronutrients affects our emotional status. And stress itself can affect our nutritional status. And we know from all of the previous slides that certain types of dietary states, is it doing it on your side too like that? Certain types, sorry about that. Certain types of diet, I'm almost done with my slides. Certain types of dietary states have a lot to do with how well we continue in life and whether or not we thrive. So this bidirectionality, we know that, so why the focus on inflammation? As I had mentioned earlier, inflammation is one of the mechanisms, inflammation, oxidative stress, but it's one of the mechanisms that determines how well we do as we age. And inflammation is basically a biochemical immune process. And inflammation spurs the disease process of all of those primary diseases that we've been talking about today. And inflammation is high when you eat an inflammatory diet. Inflammation is high when psychosocial stress isn't kept in check. Inflammation is high when we're not moving around. Inflammation is high when we're not sleeping well. And so all of this sort of comes together on whether or not you are creating an environment for your body that is inflammatory or anti-inflammatory or low in inflammation. I mean, you're always going to have some inflammation here and there. And inflammation acutely is actually adaptive. The reason we have inflammation is because if there's an injury, if there's something acutely that happens, those inflammatory mechanisms are good. But then they're supposed to then go away after the immediate threat, the immediate injury is gone. The problem with us is that we artificially create high inflammation all the time. And so that fight, that fire continues to then burn us up, and not just the whatever it is that is causing an acute problem. And so, as we go back to a reminder of our blue zones, moderate intake of calories, plant-based diet, stress reduction, physical activity, community and family, and the talk previous to mine, do everything he said to sleep well at night. Dr. Brainerd knows. And so I will shamefully have my own book here as a guide to the blue zones, but it is all of the things that I talk about, from diet and nutrition to exercise to meditation. All of those things are important to sort of balance, and how to do that is important. Some of the other things that I sort of emphasize with patients and in the book is that it's sort of on us. We have to be proactive. What we've gotten into in this society is sort of a passive approach to our health and well-being. We sort of let it go, and then once there's a problem, we go to the doctor. But remember, the healthcare system is set up to put out fires. It isn't set up to prevent the fires in the first place, and it isn't set up really to prevent the next one. That we have to do. And so that sort of self-empowered way of being, it's the reason that a lot of other countries overall do better than us, because there's more of a proactive approach that needs to be taken in terms of our health and well-being. Honestly, I don't know why it's doing this. So we know that data sometimes helps some people, right? So I tell people, pay attention. And you can pay attention using technology and data however you want to. So for example, maybe going on an app or a website like MyFitnessPal and actually looking at what the calories and nutrients in your food are, just paying attention to what you're doing and making a concerted effort to pay attention leads to behavioral change. It's one of the first things. So when you think about whether you do a yogic meditation every day, or you do one of, I know that Dr. Reibel is one of your speakers, a mindfulness meditation, all of these things help you to pay attention. And when you pay attention to what you eat, it's going to change what you eat. But you have to start by paying attention. And also, the more you do, the easier it is to do the next thing. And so when people sort of, even when the book first came out, they're like, oh, but all those things, I'm like, start anywhere in the book. Say you want to start with this or start with that. And I say that to all of you and to anyone you're interacting with or trying to help. Don't be all or nothing, and make changes gradually, because each change you make helps you to make the next one. All right, this slide wants to make itself known. So I have this slide here for a reason. The reason I have this slide is to remind everybody how hard change is. Change is hard. Certain types of changes are harder than others. I find that changing diet is difficult because it isn't a matter of, many people have been to the doctor and say, oh, your labs are getting out of control, change your diet. And then you go home and you don't change your diet. Because first of all, you need to have the right information. So that's step one. So, you get the right information. But then when you have the right information, you've got some things stacked against you. People in our country have things stacked against them. One of the things is the out of control processed foods, food additives, and all of the snack foods, all of these things that actually are addictive. They are very hard. You have to approach it like an addiction. I tell people, you won't feel well, like somebody who's withdrawing from a drug. If the thing you need to give up is X, we identify it. If this first thing you need to give up is X because it's really causing problems. And not to pick on Oreos, it could be something else. It's just that this study was done on Oreos. Then, when you're deprived of them, you'll feel it. You'll crave them. You'll want them. You'll think about them. You'll fantasize about them. You'll realize that you and that Oreo had a relationship you didn't even know about. And it's a relationship that's toxic and you've got to get rid of. But it's hard to do. I mean, this was a study, that was done in rats, but basically over time, the Oreos were more reinforcing and more addicting than cocaine was. So we know, and listen, the people in the junk food industry have some of the smartest people working for them. They have food scientists who are in the lab, not doing the great things Dr. Brainerd is doing in his lab, but they're like thinking about what is the relative balance of sweet to salty, weight on the palate that's going to make this food the most reinforcing, and if we add this to it, what's going to make them want to come back for it more? And then they test those products, often in third world markets, to see how much you want to grab more and more and more and more of it. So like this is done on purpose because that's part of the free market. They're allowed to do that, right? So you, as being part of the free market, can choose what you buy, what you feed the people that you love. And all of that, while all of that is true, let's also acknowledge that it's hard and that changing some of these things is difficult to do. And so how I would like to conclude is if, for a moment, each of you think about one thing that you would like to change right now in terms of creating your next level of your own mini blue zone. Just think about it for a second, right? And as you think about that thing, what are the feelings that come up for you? Is it excitement, dread? And as you think about that thing, you know you're not doing it. What are you saying to yourself about yourself? What judgment is there? Just think about that for a moment. I'm not going to ask anyone to share any, but this is for you, right? Because what I find and have found over the years is that, one, we need to be thinking about these things, but two, it doesn't work if we approach these things from a critical place. It doesn't work if we approach these things from a punitive place. And in terms of the great disconnect, one of the things we've gotten very disconnected from in this society is our relationship with ourselves. And we can't be that successful at making change unless we're thinking about that relationship with ourselves and approaching it right kind of way. And that's why, I'm such a proponent of meditation and the work that Dr. Pratap does. And also, when you hear from Dr. Reibel, I put one of her meditations in my book. It's the loving kindness meditation. Because unless you're approaching your own behavioral change from a place of loving kindness versus that voice, the one that is the opposite of that we have going on in there way too often, that we've internalized in this world way too often, unless it's coming from that loving kindness place, it's going to be much harder to make the change. So if you'll, with me, just do this little exercise for just a moment. We're going to take 5 breaths in. And you're going to say this to yourself as you're breathing in. So a nice deep breath, the way you know to breathing in, I notice my body. If you are comfortable closing your eyes, just notice your body. Breathing out, I smile at my body like a mother smiles at her newborn baby. Breathing in, I notice my body. Breathing out, I smile at my body like a mother smiles at her newborn baby. Breathing in, I notice my body. Breathing out, I smile at my body like a mother smiles at her newborn baby. One more time. Breathing in, I notice my body. Breathing out, I smile at my body like a mother smiles at her newborn baby. Now open your eyes, and I want you to kind of go back to that thing you want to change and think about it again. And notice if you're able to sort of approach it with any different feelings, just from that one little checking in with yourself, that one little connection with yourself in a loving way. And if you're able to approach it, saying something to yourself a little differently than maybe you were a couple of minutes ago. And the more you approach anything you want to do in your life with that place of kindness towards self, because since we're not a blue zone, what we have is a lot of disconnection in families, in communities, and in the world, in isolation. Isolation, wow. Loneliness, we have an epidemic of that. And all of the thoughts and emotions that come with all of the traumas and disconnects and things like that don't get dealt with well in a society like ours, as opposed to those really connected blue zones. So that's one of the things you have to create for yourself, the sense of community, come to things like this more, and the sense in the relationship with yourself, because that'll help you to make whatever other changes you need to make to create your own little mini blue zone. And with that, I think that was it. Wait, where am I going? So, free. I do lots of videos on YouTube. I just started a channel a few months ago because people kept asking for them. And it's at Dr. Dan Monti. There's no charge for them. And I interview people on things I don't know as much about. Like Dr. Newberg will talk about spirituality in the brain. Maybe I can get Dr. Brainerd to do an interview with me one of these days. And so we talk about these great topics. Dr. Reibel is on there, who's going to be speaking. So happy anniversary again, YRS and Dr. Pratap, and what a wonderful, wonderful event. Thank you for letting me be here. I guess I have time for a few questions.
All right. I was just running over here. So the idea of substituting plant-based proteins for meat proteins can be a tricky thing. We have that acronym UPF now, ultra-processed foods.
Yes.
So when we thought we were doing ourselves favors by getting fake meat and milk substitutes, maybe not so much. What are your feelings about effectively substituting plant-based proteins for meat?
Yeah, it's a really good question and one that I get a lot. And some people, because of their protein needs, may need to use minimally processed, like a plant-based protein powder that has little else in it, along with, that they might put in their smoothie or things like that. Ideally, you would balance things like nuts, legumes, things like that, but it isn't always easy to get everything. And so that's why we use some of those in our practice, some of those plant-based protein powders. And, to your point, you're right that some of the quote-unquote, meat substitutes are very processed. I still think they're better. But they're very processed, and they're probably less inflammatory because they don't have the saturated fat in them. But, oftentimes they have chemical additives to them. And I think that the milk alternatives should be in moderation also. I think that we can navigate some of it, but like an excess of it probably isn't good from everything we've seen.
Thank you. And I have a sort of part two to that.
Okay.
It's my understanding, sort of broad brushstroke, that combining legumes with grains creates enough amino acids in combination for your body to make a complete protein. Am I accurate in that?
Yes, and what's great is there's a lot of apps that help you to do that now, whereas before we would have to guess. But it requires a little bit of work too. And so when I'm working with patients, we find the right balance. Not everybody can do this completely vegan, so they might use a little bit of fish with some plant-based proteins, with combination of legumes and whole grains. That is the right approach. I mean, that combination, doing those combinings, the macrobiotic people back in the in the 70s, that was what they were all about, right? And, one of the things that I find, saddened is there's actual less food community than there used to be. I remember in the city when not just, there was, the Essene market, which would have meals that people would line up for and other places you could go around the city. And when the larger commercial stores that included some of the products that were sold to kind of squeeze those out, what got lost isn't just is the community, which was important, but also some of those great prepared foods. So you would think, oh, I think I could make this. And a lot of times, so people have to kind of figure it out now because we don't have as much exposure to a lot of those terrific things that used to be around a lot more plentifully.
In terms of leafy green vegetable or
Yeah.
green vegetables, better value cooked or raw?
It's a good question. And when people are sort of getting their gut back, because a lot of people have damaged guts where they're not digesting food anymore well and all of those kinds of things, they might have a hard time navigating a lot of raw vegetables, right? That's something that requires a pretty intact gut. So what I tell people to do is, I'm a fan of, because I'm not a huge salad eater, so I'm a fan of smoothies, so I'll use the vegan protein powder with maybe a little bit of nut butter, and today I had a few blueberries I put in there, and then a great big handful of raw spinach, because step one of digestion is done when you put it into the smoothie. And so when you don't feel like you can navigate too much of the raw, I love putting it in a smoothie because you might even be getting more nutritional value because you're so greatly increasing the surface area of all the particles of that, of that plant once you put it in something like a NutriBullet or a Vitamix or whatever you like to make the smoothie. So I would say try to get in a nice helping of raw every day. And if you're not someone that does well with it in the form of a salad or whatever way you would eat it, lettuce cup or kale cups or whatever, then make a smoothie. And ease your way into it if you have a gut that's been pretty shut down.
Okay. And one more thing, how do you best determine the amount of inflammation in your body?
The amount of what?
Inflammation that you have?
Well, it's difficult. So, and when inflammation is, I mean, oftentimes these are things that we're looking at when people come. So when people are sick, we can tell. So if somebody comes into our clinic and they're inflamed, I mean, they might have something called a C-reactive protein, which is an indicator of inflammation that's really high. We also look at clinically what's going on, and then for people who are challenging, we'll look at genomics profiling, and we'll see that they have a tendency to go down a certain pathway. A lot of the testing we do also will indirectly let us know that there's inflammation. So it's a combination, but for people to just know themselves, any of the kind of illnesses that we're talking about have an inflammatory component, and they will get worse with inflammation. And we notice inflammation when it's in our joints or something because it hurts, right? But that's just one manifestation of inflammation. Yes, sir.
My 99-year-old father.
Good.
I'm a caregiver for my 99-year-old father. The food that they serve in all of the senior institutions that he has ever been in is atrocious. I give him supplements. How do you compensate for something like that? I mean, I make sure he gets his omega-3 fatty acids. He's been a supplement freak since he was in his 50s.
Yeah, well, you're doing God's work there. That's wonderful. And if you think it's bad in his facility, I work at Thomas Jefferson University and have constantly gone to battle for what's being served in the hospital itself as food. And this is a challenge because the disconnect about food and health, is in the medical world too. Only very recently is there been a push for doctors, nurses, healthcare providers to understand nutrition better. And so basically in institutions and healthcare facilities, they focus on what people like what they will like to eat versus what will be nutritive to them. And so you're doing the right thing. That's exactly what I'd make sure those omega-3s, you're doing it, because inflammation is something you want to keep down. He's 99, God bless him, that's great.
Hi, I was kind of curious about the line that said that nuts are better than eggs and dairy and particularly legumes. How much are they better than, and why?
Oh, so this was an outcome of a study, right? So it lets you know how bad the meat was because we know that the dairy can be really inflammatory for some people as well, right? And dairy is really problematic as people age because, probably 2/3 of adults are lactose intolerant. So what does that tell you about whether or not we should have it? And however, a lot of times they don't sort of make the distinction of what kind of dairy in a study like that. So, if somebody's eating yogurt versus drinking a glass of milk, and those fine distinctions weren't made, it was sort of in the data that was presented, but it does kind of let you know that, it's still less of a problem, and I think the dairy really can be a problem than the meat was. But a very good observation. Well, thank you again, everybody. It was such a pleasure. Dr. Top.